run a Discord server that's a research server, right?
Oh,
So I was originally a part of the Telos bound server.
yep. Hmm.
I was a mod there for a very short amount of time. Trey was a good friend of mine. We
Great.
we actually knew Trey when he first started making videos. I was making videos about at the same time. I was going through critical theory and other theories of social inequalities because I was working and studying. So I have a bachelor's in economics with a concentration in behavioral economics.
Ah,
And then I went and did my master's in economics, which is a focus in quantitative theory. And then I'm finishing up my PhD right now. And that's in public policy. And so
wow.
I was going through all of this social inequality. I was actually connected to James Lindsay in the very beginning because I was doing something very similar to James Lindsay, although we weren't too connected, right? And so I actually had a small falling out with James Lindsay over Pierre Bourdieu because I'm in the system for public policy. I know all of these, left wingers and all of their
Yep.
work in public policy, and he's talking about Hegel leading into Herbert Marcuse, and I
Yeah.
was like, look, you're not actually dealing with the problem of those who are implementing policy. Like, sure, they're like pseudo informed by Herbert Marcuse and stuff like that, but really, you need to go into where there's actual literature being built where people are
Completely agree.
actually where people are fundamentally making decisions on someone's theoretical presuppositions. And I was like, you need to be going into Pierre Bourdieu because if you want to talk about European social policy, it's motivated heavily by Pierre Bourdieu. If you want to talk about something like social policy in the U.S. when it comes to inequality, what is it, linguistic violence, and all of these different intersections of how people go. You need to look into Pierre Bourdieu because that's where you start having that. And so as I was going through this, I ended up looking into like who was the last people that were considered the conservatives in the sociology sphere. And that's when I came across Talcott Parsons, who got me into cybernetics. And then I also came across Peter Sorokin, who's basically a big motivator for all of my work moving forward, right? So he was a Russian Orthodox Christian, although that's kind of up in the air. He was very closely related to Bardiev and some of those. He had some discussions with the Parisian Orthodox. And so anyway, so at this time I run into Trey. I start doing videos on baptizing cybernetics because I was teaching cybernetics. And then so as we continue moving forward, I started in somewhere in between this, and I'd actually spoken to you, I think, once or twice in Trey's server.
Yeah.
And then Trey's server got blown up for whatever reason. I have no idea. I ended up leaving. I started my own server. It was specifically for research. I think Jockin ended up getting an invite through one of my friends that was still connected to Trey's old server that ended up being taken over by All Heart, so on and so forth. And so there's just been a filter of people from old Trey server into mine. Uh, Reaching out for the research interests and just focusing on that. So that's the main goal of this. It's not like, hey, how you doing? There is some discussion, how you do's, but mostly it's people posting their papers, people posting, books that they're
Uh,
going through, discussions on that. And so there's a broad spectrum of different theological perspectives, right? So we've got people from cybernetics, we've got people who are economists, we've got people who are sociologists, political scientists. So it's just a whole swath of people, really invigorating a slew of different conversations. And so it allows me to have a lot broader expansion of what I work on, which has really helped me because, if you study cybernetics or systems theory, you can apply those principles to any system, right? Like it's open to application on anything. And so by doing that, and given my background in economics, pushing it into the economic sphere, and then also because I work in public policy, political science is always connected. And so that mirror between political science, cybernetics, and uh, economics has been really, really useful. And then obviously my work in theology, which is primary now, like it's really become like a big primary principle of my life, studying the Holy Fathers and continue forward with my life in Orthodoxy. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's magnificent, Econ. I mean, I thank you for sharing all that. And I really respect people that go into the depths of economics because I don't think enough people do. And then they want to discuss what the country needs or what people need and so on and so forth. It's a terrible tendency. I also really appreciate what you're saying on James Lindsay. I think discovering the hermetic roots of Hegel and tying that together to some lineage that is ultimately responsible for wokeism today, I do think is problematic. I think someone like a Pierre Bourdieu, I was just reading, I was working on distinctions for belonging again. I think his work is much more important to consider. Well, honestly, I think a paper like you've written here on the ethics of influence is what we really, really need to think because that, like the idea of nudging, for example, that is absolutely going on in public policy because it's like, oh, well, it's not immoral. It's not unethical. Well, it's very problematic because you have an assumed outcome in mind that you're thinking that you can realize. So I really appreciate your focus on that. I think also, I'm not sure to say something very large. I'm not sure if you can be educated without a study in theology. And one of the reasons is because theology is one very interdisciplinary. Like it is not actually focused on abstract questions that have nothing to do with everyday life. Like if you're going to talk about God, you talk about history, you end up talking about politics and social policy and history and community and economics and all of these different things. And it is arguably the reason why the quality of thought in theology, in my opinion, can be so high is because these people truly believe that ideas matter. And they truly believe that understanding these things have stakes, where I think a lot of people today, with ideas, it can almost, well, it can be tenure, it can be careerism, it can be fun. I'll never forget in one of the literature classes where the professor said the point of literature is pleasure. I was like, no, it is not. It's about life and death. If we don't understand, story is a way to understand how humans are, and if we don't get that, we're in massive trouble. So it's either this kind of frivolous, fun tenure thing, or ideas are being used for manipulation. And I
Mhm.
think nudging is getting at that. And also, I think when you don't like in theology, the quality of theological thought is always very interesting because it's a unit. I'd be curious any thoughts of anything. It's a unity between the particular and the universal. Like it's not like in these thoughts about how God is, it or etc. It necessarily is going to have an impact on your daily life. Like it is necessarily going to translate into the immediate, which to me, I'd be curious what you think. Immediately to me is always the fine balance of cybernetic thinking in general. Like not losing the particular for the total, but also realizing the total cannot be predicted. The total cannot be have a set quantitative goal ahead of time that you're going toward. Otherwise, it's going to be manipulative. And theology, I think, at its best, tends to have that kind of character to it. Just off the cuff there, those are just some thoughts I was having. So that's amazing, all the work you do, Econ.
Yeah, thank you. And to respond real quick on that point, this is something that I try to get people to understand when it comes to like determinism, right? They're like, oh, the universe is deterministic. Absolutely, but indeterminism is a subset of determinism, and that's laid out by Ashby in his Introduction to Cybernetics. Just like we live in a discrete world, right? So we have the proposition of discrete, right? But we also all know that time is continuous, right? Like fundamental reality is discrete, but true reality, the really real, is obviously a continuous proposition. So there is always that indeterminism of whatever output. Even if it is determined, it's still indeterminate. And this ends up turning into chaos theory, right? Well, we know the outcome and we know the beginning, but we don't know the centerpiece in between it, right? Because we may not understand those initial conditions, and initial conditions lead to different outcomes. Even if it does lead to the same outcome, differences in the initial conditions could change what the outcome would be. And all of this gets into like free will, right? Which is connected to everything in this idea of nudges. And and the reason I ended up getting into nudges is so first, when I was finishing my bachelor's, my concentration was in behavioral economics, and I was working with a behavioral economist, and she was doing a lot of work in nudge theory. And I was trying to join when I got out. I was going to go through finishing my master's, and I was going to go be a part of a nudge unit, which is people who get together whether it's for private or public, right? Like we have nudge units in the US. They're more prominent in places in Europe, especially in England. There's a book that came out on the nudge unit connected to this, and I was really closely associated with nudges. Now, at this time, I was obviously a secularist. I didn't really care about religion. I didn't grow up religious or anything along those lines. And so as I'm going through this, it was during COVID, right? During COVID is also the time that I ended up becoming religious, right? Like, this is pretty much everyone. But uh, as I'm going through this, there was a public policy health discussion, so health policy, and I am not libertarian, but I'm also not big on government
Sure.
intervention,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Hmm.
And so we're doing this discussion, and this person goes in, hey, we really got to get out here. We've got to start getting these people to take these vaccines. And they were like, hey, we really got to be pushing nudges. And so they're just laying out this full diagram of how public policy can influence people to do things. And I remember I was sitting with a fairly left-leaning professor of mine, and I was like, hey, this is a bit egregious compared to everything else that I've ever worked in on nudges, because I have a
Hmm.
background in nudges. And they were like, yeah, this is they're very aggressive with the way that they were positioning this. And I was like, okay, this is problematic. And
Hmm.
so then I was working with another professor who does ethics of public policy, and we were having this discussion, and I was like, I think the big problem of nudges is, one, there's the epistemological problem that you know more than I do, right? But then you're in the local knowledge problem, right? Like, you as up here, you don't have the specified knowledge to actually tell me what I ought to do, right? This is subjectivism at its highest point, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But there is a local knowledge problem that those higher up cannot deal with. And I was like, that's the first problem. But like, second is like, if you don't have the knowledge that I have and you get me to do something, like, this is an inauthentic representation of what I need to do or what I want to do. And so going through this inauthenticity, especially going through it with the Heideggerian focus of Mitsein and what I would call like the transparent relations of persons, in against personalism, by the way, I'm not a personalist, but really looking into Heidegger's Das Man. And we have these hidden intentions and this disclosedness, right? Like, this starts to misshape reality, because if you actually thought about reality in a serious fact, and this is the best way that I can probably post this in my mind. If you believe that what you are doing is good, then what we end up with is this idea that everyone is seeking the good for everyone else, which is what everyone does, right? Like, this is the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle. We seek the good in others. Just because we seek the good doesn't mean that we understand the good, right? But trying to get people to understand that they don't understand the good ends up becoming a problem in and of itself, where people then want to nudge. I want to nudge you to the good. But
Mm.
the key here is, okay, so first thing is transparency. A lot of people call this an institutional value, right? So my background from the master's in econometrics was focusing on the theory of corruption and how it intersects with corruption, and then income inequality, wealth inequality, and economic growth. So in that, transparency is a big discussion for an institutional value. The more transparent your government is, the less corruption they have, the better your economic growth is going to be, so on and so forth. But it's not. Transparency is ontological, right? Systems, including us as people, right, we're operationally closed, but we're thermodynamically open. And a lot of people don't understand this. So we're operationally closed as in we have a passive intellect. This passive intellect takes in information. That's what thermodynamically open is we're open to energy and information. We take that information and we synthesize it with our own understanding, right? Our codes decode that information and it responds with what we mean by that thing, right? And so people don't understand this. They think, oh, well, the government can change your mind, so on and so forth. No, your internal codes change what that information is so that you can understand it. But what ends up happening is that we have to maintain an identity by processing these inputs through our own code. But we still need that energy and information from the outside. If we don't have that, then we don't have anything to do. We would just be empty vessels. And so for humans, our rationality and fellow feeling, to talk about like Adam Smith here, this gives us an extra layer. So we can go beyond our automatic interpretation and we can deliberately open ourselves to the other. And so what I propose is that transparency is this relational openness. It's not just a bureaucratic safeguard, because if we look at the government as an in hypostaton, so because I would say that the government is a person without personhood, right? So it is a hypostasis, it's in hypostaton. It has its own energy, which is what we would call like public policy and stuff like this. So it has all of these characteristics. It just doesn't have itself, it's not subsistent in its own reality. So it has to subsist within the reality of others. And so when we think of this fellow feeling, which would be in Adam Smith, sympathy and empathy, this isn't just a psychological representation, right? It's the structural bridge that we have that prevents us from collapsing into solipsistic monads, really, because we don't want to be just our mind. We want to be the mind in relation to others. And through that relation, we get our subsistence, which isn't to agree with Aquinas here, because a lot of people probably jump on this. Oh, I mean that our subsistence in our is indicated on us relating to one another in a way that we become who we are through knowing ourselves by looking at the alter ego and being the similitude of one another through our fellow feeling. And so because of this, because we're rational animals, because we have this relations, we can disclose ourselves to the other and we can begin to understand their meaning from their frame of reference. And so that's why openness, it's not optional. So without it, the subject-object dualism that we live in turns to isolation, right? So need is, and the why this ended up becoming right. So all, ontology is incorrect when it comes to modern choice theory. And then second is we still have to deal with the postmodern knowledge problem. And that would be like every subject interprets an object differently. So meanings end up multiplying infinitely. And there's more that I can unpack in that, but that's a broad strain of what it is. And the bad part is, and this is the part that everybody starts to falter on, is when push comes to shove, this is technically true. And this is why we don't have a really good fight with them. But it's wrong in another area, right? So in practice, we have shared deliberation, and this constrains those interpretations. So you can think of it this way, like you go to a classroom, right? And I'm like, okay, there's 30 students there. I'm like, all right, here's a text. I want all of you to read this text. Let's say it's 2 pages, and I want you to give me your interpretation independently of everyone else's. I'm going to talk to you one-on-one. So what you're going to get everybody's going to have a different reading, and you're going to have all of these different ideas being unpacked. Now you bring everybody into a room and you're like, okay, what we're going to do now, we're going to discuss what everyone says. What ends up happening is you're going to actually reduce 20 or 30, however many different interpretations down to a few plausible ones, because you're going to get persuasion and you're going to get synthesis, where you actually reduce through this intersubjectivity all of those different brands, right? And so in politics, we have Arrow's impossibility theorem that suggests voting is incoherent, right? We can't have anytime you have more than two persons all voting on different things, you're going to end up being in a deadlock and nothing ends up happening. And so we have this median voter theorem where we are trying to converge people on workable decisions through I'm going to move my position a little bit this way, they move here, but we're trying to capture this median to where people mostly agree. This is our reduction of complexity. And so what this means is that deliberation is a meaning reduction mechanism.
Hmm.
And so here's the kicker in all of this, wrapping it around, nudges short circuit this process when it comes to just epistemological claims. They force convergence without the openness, right? They do not allow for proper persuasion, disclosure, or fellow feeling to actually generate authenticity and meaning. So nudges impose the behavior on the outside, and this is why they feel inauthentic, and they yield compliance without yielding the meaning connected to it. And what's worse is once you start having a place where you don't have your own identity, you no longer have the ability to have fellow feeling, which is why we get into a place where people's isolated. People don't care about the other at all. They only want to care about their internal team. And that's because we continuously are bombarded from outside inauthentic messaging. And because of that, we no longer have the ability to relate to what is an authentic message, because what is authentic can feel inauthentic to someone who lives an inauthentic life, and they don't know themselves. They don't try to deal with this introspection. Just like you were talking about literary figures and stuff, right? Oh, it's for fun. Someone go tell Fedor Dostoevsky that literature is for fun. I feel like that man cried himself to sleep every night writing Brothers Karamazov, because I read it and I cried myself to sleep every night reading Brothers Karamazov. Same with Devils, same with
Oh, yeah.
Crime and Punishment. All of those are difficult texts to read. They're not fun. They're difficult. Shakespeare is not fun. It's difficult. Even something as simple as Tolkien's work on the Silmarillion, like that's a fun book. That's difficult. That makes you challenge children, not adults, children into a moral and ethical frame of understanding, right? So you have to be authentic with yourself when you read these novels, because you will see a mirror image of yourself, right? Like myself, I see myself often when I'm thinking, like I see myself very close to Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov, right? Like, oh, I'm an academic. I try to touch on theology, and then I battle with my own internal questions on what I truly believe, right? And that's always difficult. And so you see this mirror of yourself and you see this interaction, and you think to yourself, oh, I have to struggle with this. And that's authenticity, and that's becoming lacking. And it's because of all of this bombardment of inauthentic messaging, this non transparent messaging. And we can see this, oh, it's fake media, fake news, etc. From both sides. It doesn't matter. It's all leading to this inauthentic messaging, which stops us from being authentic in our relations. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it was absolutely fantastic, and I very much appreciate what you were saying on Dostoevsky. That's exactly right. How can you say literature is just about pleasure when you're reading demons, when you're reading the tragedy at the end of The Idiot? These things it's too simplistic. I think also Ivan is such an important character. In the Carmos, there's always the fence, and he's on the fence. They're jumping over the fence to different locations. Critically, just as a note that I always like to stress with Ivan. There's the famous idea in the Brothers Karamazov that if God did not exist, everything would be permitted, right? And that's kind of attributed to Alyosha. Well, critically, earlier in the novel, Ivan Karamazov, the one who says something along the lines of, if God did not exist, any course of action would suffice, something like that. And yet he's the one who then is upset that God lets evil with the Grand Inquisitor section. Well, this is very critical because one of the reasons Ivan, in my opinion, descends into madness is because he comes to realize that he requires the existence of the God to think that is evil, that he's upset at God for allowing. So there's this sort of torment that occurs within Ivan Karamazov. And I believe Dostoevsky was actually planning for Brothers Karamazov to be book one of a longer series called The Great Sinner that was going to be quite focused on, I would say, Ivan Karamazov. So I think that is incredibly important, and that sort of struggle, that internal struggle, one could argue that that is necessary for one to bring into their relations to have authenticity. If that struggle is not there, that internal back and forth, or we have been trained out of it, or we are brought in a way where we are socially not allowed to be with one another in it, because I think you could argue a role of the church has been to bring people together in their sin and to struggle with it in community. Struggle in community is, in my opinion, getting at a authentic relationality. It is an open kind of relationality that actually, if you do not have, like you're saying, you begin to lose it. Well, you lose energy, you lose meaning, and things start to fall apart because the center cannot hold, as Yeats may put it. And I think also with that particular internal struggle, another thing that can occur is you get kind of a social order, like you're saying, that doesn't allow it. But also the critical idea, too, that I was thinking about as you were speaking, is on the idea of nudging. Nudging, and I really appreciate you sharing your background on what you were saying, that nudging has a certain idea of an outcome that we want to get at, right? That we want to arrive at. Well, here's the issue. If I arrive at X outcome a way, then the kind of subjectivity that then experiences the outcome may not be able to sustain it, or they may feel inauthentic in it, or they may want to get rid of it. Where if I get to the same outcome by course B, then the subjects along the way of arriving at that outcome may internally transform in a manner where they're able to maintain the outcome, or they see the outcome as good, or it is one that doesn't alienate them, right? So it really does matter the way by which people realize an end. And if you get them to realize an end, if you say, okay, our goal is for everyone to take the COVID vaccine, for example, and let's say you get the number up, as Jock and well, get the good is getting the number up, a quantitative metric. Number up, good. Number up, good. Oh, really? So the number goes up. You get everyone to take the vaccine or something like that. And then 3 years later, people feel betrayed by their institutions, or they feel tricked, right? Well, you got your outcome, but now you have a kind of subject that doesn't want anything to do with the institutions, right? And that excess beyond the quantitative measure is also something that can be missed if you're not taking into account the qualitative state of the subjects or the internal operations of the subject as they realize that outcome. And how would you even calculate that? How would you even be able to think that? So there's a way in which nudge theory, and there is, in my opinion, a lot more nudging going on than people realize. Like, it is absolutely going on everywhere. And I don't think it's by chance that after regimes of nudging, you see uprisings or people upset or the social order kind of falling apart, because you got it. Like in theology, there's always that idea that God doesn't just create, but he sustains creation. He sustains being, right? Nudge theory doesn't sustain. It doesn't take seriously, in my opinion, the ontological stakes of the subject by which to sustain them in that outcome. And what you end up doing is when you get that outcome and they don't sustain it, you just other them. You just say, well, they're idiots. Well, they're just Nazis. They're just backwaters or something, right? So they don't count, right? And that's a kind of entrapment, right? A kind of closing in, which of course is entropic. Once you begin to close, you have a system that is not able to hold together. So I always think that's a massive problem with nudging. One of the things, because with belonging, again, it's more in a kind of language of social analysis, sociology, et cetera, so forth. And I like to think about Leibniz and analysis of citas. But one of the things that, when you were talking about nudging toward the mean, or the Kenneth arrow, and this is very important, where you're kind of trying to find a mean, a way that I put it is that one of the ways, what ends up happening is we have various mechanisms to create the possibility of social intelligibility or social coordination through a compression. There's a certain compression of complexity, a certain reduction to where people can meet. And if I cannot calculate, say, if people bring 20 various variables of their concerns into a meeting, then that's chaos. I can't calculate that, right? That's like a 3-body problem, right? So what I need to do is when people meet one another, I try to make them meet in a reduced, compressed manner that makes the outcome more predictable, right? Or makes it where it's more going to be susceptible to the nudging and the outcome that I want, right? So something that I will talk about is one of the ideas. So there's a lot of people that are critiquing capitalism. There's notions that there are problems with capitalism, et cetera, so forth, right? Well, the issue is if I were to encounter someone incredibly different from me, say they live in a different country, they have a different religion, and so on and so forth, and I do not have the ability to handle that level of difference, then the ability to say, what's your job? Engineer. Oh, I run a venue. Ah, we have something in common. We have a means of social intelligibility. So the market can provide means of social intelligibility. Or I can say, what is that? I say it's a flower worth $10. Okay, that's kind of a universal language, right? That's a way that we can interact. And this sort of compression can actually be incredibly useful because if two people or multiple people who are incredibly different interact and they don't have a mean to habituate themselves to handle more of the difference, then they might overwhelm one another. Like Beatrice's smile, like I always like, and I talk about it all the time, this idea that Dante is upset at Beatrice for not smiling. And why won't you smile? I think it's Canto like 29 or something. And Beatrice is like, well, if at this point in the Paradiso I would just smile, it would reduce you to ash like Simli, because it's too much glory too soon, right? There's too much sin. You have to actually go through a process and climb higher up the Paradiso before you're able to handle more beauty. Because beauty is actually overwhelming. Joy is overwhelming. It's like that one medieval idea where person comes into the grotto and the dancer's it's like, what are you doing here, you fool? This is a place of joy, as Cleo would say, as if joy can actually destroy you if you're not ready for it. And so there's this idea in the Paradiso of a unveiling, kind of with the UN in parentheses, a gradual unveiling so you can handle more glory, right? If it does it too soon, you're destroyed, but if it doesn't do it at all, then you can't be attracted, right? It's kind of like Pascal's hiddenness and things like that. Well, likewise, things like the logic of occupation, mean, averages, these things could theoretically be used to help introduce people so that they could gradually be opened up to more and more of the complexity of one or at a rate that they can handle, right? But that's not what nudging or a lot of system planners or whatever end up doing. They actually want to keep them in that compression and then train their habits to where they can't get out of it. Because that's the other problem, is your habits are trained, right? And so literally you lose the capacity to think of things beyond, say, occupation or utilitarianism. That's the main habitus of the world, like thinking of things in terms of utility or quantification, the reign of quantity, as Gerard, he'll talk about, that philosopher. And then you train your habits and you kind of get entrapped in those habits. And as you do those habits, you lose the ability to get those out of those habits more and more, and you get a very dangerous kind of feedback loop, right? As we do that, because it closes, as you were pointing out, then things become meaningless. Things, you no longer care about them, right? Because you're shutting down the Das Me. You can't have care. And then maybe you have efficiency. Maybe you're getting your outcomes. Maybe you're getting what you want, but nobody cares. Nobody cares anymore. You get your outcome, but nobody cares. So they're not going to maintain your outcome. And in fact, they may turn on your outcome and they may destroy it in order to be liberated from it. Liberated from the idea of liberation that the nudge theory was supposed to bring out, that is actually compressing and entropic in different things. But of course, this would all suggest to me the $1 million challenge we have today, which for me that you're pointing at, that I think about all the time. I really like what you're saying about transparency being in relationality, not on a systems level, but it is in the relation, right? And that, I think about transparency in those terms when I'm using this term unveiling with the U in parentheses, as Beatrice is saying. This ability, like transparency has to be in a relation, gradually developed through time so that we can kind of handle it. And then precisely that handling creates a certain meaning. It also has a certain thymotic in that classic idea of the soul, because there's a challenge to it. There's also a learning to listen, learning to engage. And also the other helps me learn about myself. Without the other, I can't even know myself, right? And actually, a lot of the unveiling of the other is necessary because I need a gradual unveiling of myself, right? We learn in various psychoanalysis that if I see myself too soon, I'm destroyed by the Lacanian real too much, too quickly, right? So you need that kind of privacy, that kind of process that is found in transparency. But then the other key to it is transparency itself has to be coordinated. It has to be felt. It has to be determined appropriate. What is fitting for this moment? What is fitting to be said? What is fitting to unveil? What is fitting to bring into the picture? What is fitting to show of myself in this situation that it is intelligible, right? Like if I start talking about, like if I'm speaking to you and I start talking about, say, taking up cows, and you're someone who doesn't even know what a cow is, theoretically possible, then this transparency would not be something that enables a relationality. In fact, you may feel talked over or not listened to, right? So I need to have an understanding of your knowledge base, what you know, what you're familiar with, to figure out how to speak with you in a manner that you feel like I'm bringing you into my world, as opposed to putting you somewhere where you can't enter it, right? As individuals in the society become more and more skilled in that capacity or have opportunities to do that, they become invested, and the world beyond them can feel intelligible, but intelligible in a manner that doesn't give them 100% full godlike knowledge over everything, but intelligible more so like a mist pulling away from the valley where you can see more and more of it with time. Like just because there's a mist doesn't mean that there's a big difference between unknowable and unknown. Right? Unknowable means that you can never gain more knowledge about it. Unknown means there's always more to know, kind of like Flannery O'Connor's idea of mystery, right? Well, that creates care. That creates excitement. That creates interest. And that also means relationality is necessary for epistemology, because if knowledge is something unveiled, well, then you can't actually learn without relationality relative to that of which develops and unveils more so through time, as lived out and experienced in the encounter of the person, right? But then the overall thing, and then I'll throw it back at you at any thoughts on anything. And I know I've said a lot. And also you said, I have many more notes on what you were saying on indeterminacy, determinacy. I think that's so important. The $1,000,000 challenge I think we have is how to bring, and this is how I may language it, and forgive me if I language things maybe slightly different. That's always, fun in conversations, finding the different language convergences and so on. Is that I think the $1,000,000 challenge we have is the maintaining meaning while also maintaining social intelligibility. Because like social intelligibility is the ability that I can go into the society and have a certain understanding of it, or I encounter other people and it is intelligible to me. Not totally known, because that's arguably the danger of central planning or system thinking, where I totally know you. No, not like that. But where in the surprise encounter of the other, there's enough intelligibility where I know how to move forward, right? How to progress and how we can relate to one another. How you can maintain social intelligibility while at the same time not making the average person, quote unquote, feel compressed, feel reduced, for the sake of that social intelligibility, right? Because what you're saying on this idea of the human, and forgive me if I don't say it exactly correctly, but you're exactly right on you're saying on like we are closed, but open, theodynamic, like we have to be open or we lose energy, right? So to the degree I can, in my social relations, feel open, actually be open, I'm going to actually have more energy. But the problem is, as I open, I can feel like I'm pulled apart almost, because I myself am opening, and that feels like what? Chaos. That feels like death. But this could arguably be why Christianity stresses dying to self, and that's why is dying to self so linked to love of neighbor? Interesting. It's almost as if it's not actually possible to love without dying to self. Well, exactly. In the theodynamic, what you're saying with the model is exactly why. Because you can't love without energy, without joy, you're not going to love. You can maybe get I guess, but you're not going to get love. You're not going to get joy. That's going to require this energy. But this energy demands something of you, because you have to be able to handle the opening of yourself when you are ultimately closed to a certain degree. You must be to have this motion of ever development. Like if you're totally open, there's no motion. It's done, right? By you being you are, again, to use my language, an unveiling in your very being. You are a continual unveiling and veiling at the same time. The Heideggerian notion of it, what as something is appears, something is also concealed, right? Well, that is what humans are. That's why we have the potential to ever develop, ever grow, and why the energy, the motion can be continual. But in order for it to be continual, I have to be able to handle the feeling of being opened and the nervousness of transparency, the difficulty of putting myself out there, but then doing it in a skillful manner by which the person of whom I am opening to is able to get energy from it, per se, not be overwhelmed and actually gain from that relationality. To me, this is a radical skill set. This is a profound skill set that if we're not able to do, a distinction I like to make with Ivan Illich that I always think about is the difference between prepare and plan. Plan is where, say, nudging, or we have a plan on how we're going to get this outcome. Preparation is if something unexpected occurs, I'm able to handle it. So, preparation is when you have skills or you have emotional training where a black swan, something unexpected occurs and you're actually able to handle it. We basically exist under the reign of planning. It's not about preparing. It's about preparing is being ready for bad things to occur. Planning is about keeping bad things from happening, actually. Well, planning is impossible and also dangerous. It makes you fragile. And it's going to have to somehow reduce complexity because that's the only way you can make sure something unexpected doesn't occur, which, of course, is a fool's errand as well, right? But preparation, and again, I just base this on Ivan Illich, preparation means you have to plan, you have to be prepared for that's unexpected. How do you prepare for the unexpected? What do you even know what to do, right? How do you even know the criteria of the unexpected? Yeah, that's the challenge. And basically nothing short of subjects that are prepared, more so than plan-based, is going to be able to maintain adaptability, dynamicism in the system or in the social order. But that's an entirely different education system. That is an entirely different socioeconomic order. And I suppose the last thing to say, I do think, honestly, theology was the best at this because theology is always playing this interesting double thing where it is saying, hey, there's order. Let me just say it very simplistically. There is a God. Things are in order. God has sovereignty. But you never know how God's going to show up. You never know what's going to occur. You never know how demonic force is going to exploit. So there's this very interesting idea that there's both sustaining and yet at the same time, surprise. This unexpected element. And actually you could argue that the Holy Spirit is, it's a kind of organization that is coherent without top-down. There's a Holy Spirit that is kind of moving in an intelligible way to realize real outcomes, but in a non-top-down way and in a manner where the outcomes cannot be planned ahead of time, even if you can intuit a general notion of what they may look like. So, for example, an increase in holiness. Okay, well, what would it look like for Virginia to increase in holiness? I couldn't quantify that, but I bet you I could tell if I walked into a room with more holiness. So that's the interesting idea. You can't quantify holiness, but you can absolutely identify it when you encounter it. And that's kind of the trick, is if you're doing, in my opinion, policy properly, you will incubate certain auras, certain atmosphere, certain vibes. I've even talked a lot about vibes, right? That you'll be able, it is in a sense testable. It is testable in the sense of you can experience it, but it's only testable in relationality. It cannot be quantified outside the relationality. You have to go into the church. You have to go into the space. Then you will be able to identify if there is holiness or not. You're not going to be able to quantify it. And that, from a top-down perspective, or from someone who wants to write reports and prove that I'm actually doing something, that's not going to suffice, right? The tyranny of proving you did something. If you're under the tyranny of having to prove something, it almost by definition is going to end up in quantitative, unless you can say, come and see, like Jesus. If you're in a local area and you're able to say, come and see, it can do, but But then we get into power dynamics where maybe there's incentive for people not to come and see so they can legitimize the regime of quantification, right? It's like, come and see. Nope, I'm not. I just know you're stupid. Oh, okay. If you came and see, you would know there's something to it. So there could be some dominant strategy moves that can used as well. But I really appreciate everything, but I'll stop and throw to you for any thoughts on anything.
Oh, wow. I have tons of thoughts because everything you said is a lot of what I work on and I love it. Thank you so much. So social intelligibility, this is a big factor in some of my work, right? And I'm going to try to roll all of this together and it's going to be a bit crazy. So
It's gonna
let's
be
try to
fun.
think.
That's my
Yes.
favorite. Crazy is my favorite.
Okay. No, it's not fun. It's serious. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, okay, social intelligibility. We are a mind. We are a mind, right? So we are a shared humanity. We are a shared nature, right? And we all have our different participations in what it is to be, but we also have our different participations within the system itself, right? Because we don't participate in one another. I'm not you, you not me. You don't, I can't be you, you can't be me, right? But we can both be human, right? So this is this idea of only communication communicates. A lot of people are like, that doesn't make any sense. I communicate with people. No, you do not. You communicate at the level of nature, right? And just think about it. Like if I communicated you myself, then I've communicated what makes me me to you, then you are me, and then we've broken the entire point, right? So only communication communicates, right? So this is like an anti-humanist piece of rhetoric that I've always stuck to through Nicholas Luhmann because his communications theory is really broad when it comes to this, right? And then this connects to that reduction of complexity that you were talking about. I had actually run some analysis on this, both in public policy as well as in small group decision making processes. And one of them was looking at the shared communication channels of the Federal Reserve board members and the chairman. And so the way I explain it, so imagine there's King Arthur, right? King Arthur has his knights. All right, his knights are landowners. So his landowners, they have a distributed set of landowners who have a distributed set of landowners who have a bunch of peasants. Right. Okay. So each one of these places is in a disparate territory with disparate problems, right? Somebody may be dealing with a Viking scourge, and someone over here may be dealing with demonic incursion, so on and so forth, right? So we have these peasants. They're saying, hey, to their vassals, this is the problem, we need help, right? And they're all disparate. These are 1,000 different peasants. They have to tell one person all of the problems. This person takes it and goes, okay, here's the commonality. So I take this shared basket of problems. Here's the big problems and here's the shared problems. All right, so I take it up. I'm sitting with my lord. He has 6 other vassals. We take our problems, boom, we hand it to him. What do? He takes those and he goes, okay, I'm grabbing the commonality of it. These are the ones that can be pushed back down. Hey, you have the ability to deal with this, this, and this. This is by the Ostroms. This is called polycentric governance, where governance is meant to be done at the lowest level possible, and that it should be by on the shared interest of one another, right? So, and then we go up. So we have those lords. They take it to their lords, right? So there's 6 lords. They all have their different. And so we've started with these 1,000 peasants and these 1,000 different interpretations and these 1,000 different ideas that need to be done. And so we go there and we're like, okay, here we are. We're going to take it. We're going to go to the next level. And then finally, you get to the knights at the round table, and they have to express all of this complexity. And all of it gets reduced into this simple piece of discussion to where each one of these lords take and say, hey, here's our common interest. Here's our common bond. Here are the things that we specifically need help with from the king. That is how you reduce the complexity of small group decision-making processes. That is the key. And that only happens through these communication channels of unveiling, right? Because that unveiling is that two-way street between these two different works. That's the transparency of the relationality that's needed. And I have a set of videos where I defend capitalism from all different types of attacks from it, from socialists to anarcho-capitalists, so on and so forth, to an understanding of what is capitalism, right? And I say I defend it from anarcho-capitalist because I do think that those who hold to this subjectivist ontology, those who hold to this like very libertarian market first mindset, they miss the point of capitalism. Capitalism is the shared relationality of the other through transactions and market
Yes.
processes, just as you laid out, right? Like this is what we need in our society. If you go to socialism, there's not that relationality that you get. If you go to hardcore capitalism where nobody cares about the other, it's all self-interest. First of all, you miss the entire point of what Adam Smith wrote in his
Yes.
books
Oh, yes.
because you didn't read the theory of moral sentiment.
No.
You didn't read his reflections on Aristotle because again, this idea of the moral good that's based on people who taught Adam Smith, this is important to what's going on and what he's trying to portray. He's trying to make an argument for fellow feeling against the fatalism of like the Presbyterian Church in Scotland that a lot of people don't really understand. Like the philosophers that were like quasi theologians at the time in his area, they're battling against the Presbyterian Church, coming with this hardcore Calvinist position of we are disgusting human creatures, etc. Right? Like, not to say that we aren't guilty and whatever that means, and not to say that we don't deserve damnation, but the idea is that there is still some participation in the good that we can take a hold of and we can utilize, and that is the common good. That is our commonality. That is our shared interest, not our self-interest, right? If we look at the it's not by the interest of the butcher, it's his self-interest. His self-interest only makes sense in so fact as he relates to you. His self-interest is that you don't die so you can come back. That's not per se like self-interest. That's, hey, I understand how you feel. So there's this fellow feeling of sympathy and empathy that's connected to my self-interest because I don't want you to be harmed because I know what it feels like to be harmed. That is the self-interest. Altruism is the self-interest, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so this goes against everything that the Benthamites state. And so the next piece is the habit doing and the habit being dangerous, and how this is worked throughout. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about Pierre Bourdieu being the fundamental property or the fundamental person that we really need to focus on. And it shouldn't be just him, but his corpus and those who follow him, especially in the realm of public policy, when it comes to these social and cultural values of habit, etc. These are very, very important. These are the key mechanisms motivating policy at some of the highest levels, especially on the left and even the right. So if you do want to talk about the woke right, that would be the neoconservative move towards the habits and the hearts and minds of the people away from moral and ethical values, as Tocqueville laid out in his Democracy in America, right? And so then we go into this idea of of how do we do this understanding and how do we have this reduction of complexity in its fullest, right? And the other and the fitting for unveiling, etc. This is where I think the two most important people that people need to read is one is Peter M. Sorokin, and the next one is Jane Jacobs. So Peter M. Sorokin's a sociologist, a moral conservative that I discussed earlier. He has a book called Ontological Love, or the ways and power of love and ontological treatment of love in Change. And the other one is Jane Jacobs and her Death of the American City.
Yeah.
Right? So this is first an epistemological point. Love is an epistemological power. So it's how we require space for the heart in scientific analysis. So if we think that love is an energy, because love is information and information changes things, right? So this improves our scientific inquiry, because if we have nothing, then we're not going to be able to know nothing. But if we have love, then we have mutual interiority, right? We have that allopericoesis. This mutual interiority allows us to have this shared realities, complexity that can be reduced. So scientific knowledge as well, and I mean scientific knowledge both as in scientific and both as in the ancient form of scientific knowledge, has to be integrated, right? Where we have to have combining sensory, we have to combine rational, and we have to combine intuitional dimensions to really comprehend truth and reality fully. And love is the core epistemological force because it is the creative altruistic energy that it leads us to the pursuit of truth. And so when we think about this distinction between system one and system two thinking from Daniel Kahneman, like we really have to understand that the love is this biggest cognitive channel, because love harmonizes the rationality, it harmonizes the intuition, it helps us reduce the complexity of reality, it helps us make something cognizable, just
Right.
as just as Jane Jacobs has laid down, that like we look at reality, right? Okay, so we have these planners, they're coming up with the most efficient processes possible, and the city is dead. People hate it. It's gross. I don't want to see gray buildings that do nothing. I need aesthetic enrichment. I need a reality that has feeling. And so that can only be done by by a lover, right? Because we have to have a fuller fuller comprehension of those things, and only through love can we ever get to that point. And to wrap this piece up real quick, if you want the answer to errors and possibility theorem, love is actually the answer. If you impute love into the dynamics of, oh, three persons can't come together on one conclusion, that altruistic force actually does lead to conclusions that overcome errors and possibility theorem. And this is I have a proof of this on stability theory, but it is the case. Mystery is care that goes into it, right? So I have to care about the mystery. And that again, mystery is care, is love.
Yep.
And so that's how we bring about this maintaining of meaning and social intelligibility, is through love. And again, when we think about Brothers Karamazov, the key that we need to think of here is from Alyosha and from Elders Osmos. So Alyosha, everybody comes to Alyosha. They love him. He's the cherub. He's the bind of everybody else's epistemological opinion. He's the binding of everybody else's small group decision-making processes, because he is the center of love. And that's why Elders Osmos tells him, like, hey, you have to go out to the world, blah, blah, blah. But it's also why Elders Osmos has such heartfelt connections to the family, right? That's why he bows down before Dmitri. That's why he has these conversations with Ivan and encourages Ivan towards understanding his own position better, is because he knows that to open himself means the other is going to be more open to this openness. And it's the mystery of the other that allows him to care and love. And it also allows him to reflect upon himself, which is what we see when he talks about Alyosha being similar to his brother. That's the openness and the care and the love that's brought in. And so that's how we do this social intelligibility and this meaning making system, that we don't have to deal with that compression. And the last piece on this compression, there's actually probably my favorite sociologist, Talcott Parsons. He wrote on this compression, and it's something that I had a discussion on. In our modern day, we no longer have roles.
Mm.
Think about it.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about how do we
Mm.
have this double contingency, right? So, oh, well, you're doing something with farming and I'm not. But the first thing that was said, he's like, oh, well, I'm having this thing that I'm doing with my grass. And I said, oh, I understand that. I'm having to do stuff here. That is a role that we now have shared interest in. And that allows us to have that open, that double contingency. So roles are important for us to relate to one another. Roles are also important for us to disclose ourselves, or to enclose ourselves, to hide ourselves. Our roles are what allow us to be hidden. My role at my job is different than the role that I have as a father, is different than the role as I have an academic or whatever. Each one of these roles are compartmentalized, that I can be open and closed in them. What ends up happening in modern times, going back to this problem of inauthenticity, we no longer have roles. We have social media. Social media is not a role.
Right.
Social media is the openness of all the roles. So if I say something, let's just say controversial here as an academic, that can spill over to my job. It can spill over to my family. It can spill over to each one of these different compartmentalized groups, my hobbies, whether it's table tennis or Warhammer 40K or Magic the Gathering. All of these are just smashed together into one thing that is me, without me being able to compartmentalize and hide and open simultaneously. So this is what leads again to this bombardment of messaging that I'm not allowed to hide within myself on this. So this constant messaging is that feedback loop that you're discussing that is compressing everything, because it compresses our roles and our ability to compartmentalize ourselves to the other within relation to society. And this is a big problem. And as it unfolds, discussion here on the dying to the self as the necessity of it. Again, I consider this the alio-perichoresis, the opening of the self to the other, right? And I want to make room for the other in myself, because myself is essentially empty without those relations. So the more that I have in them, the more that I have outward, right? And so this leads into courage. This is something that I think is one of the most lacking things in modern society, even in places where people are courageous, because courage is the overcoming of what we have to deal with ourselves, right? Like, we have to have courage to face ourselves. We have to have courage to open ourselves. We have to have courage to look down and think, hey, maybe I will be hurt for what I've said. Maybe I will be hurt because I don't have these roles. I have to be able to overcome this, and we can only overcome this by courage. And this is one of the big points to be laid out. And this is the radical piece of the openness, is the courage to do it. And courage can only happen by participation in what it is to be courageous by God. And that's why we need to unfold ourselves to the great other, which is God. The last thing is on risk and danger, right? I think the best book on this topic is Nicholas Luhmann's Risk, a Sociological Theory. He actually goes through and he lays out, like, hey, here's what risk is, here's what danger is. Like, for example, there was never a word for risk for quite some time in human history. Like, risk is a relatively new idea of understanding the world. Danger was something that people had to deal with. So you always had to be prepared for danger. You didn't plan for risk, you were prepared for danger. And the way we think about it now is we have risk management work, right? So we have this value at risk. And so we need to do these numbers and we need to figure out, oh, what do we do under this Six Sigma, right? And so our higher institutions, how they interact with the world is through risk management, which is preparation. And yet the world wants us to act as if we're the planners of it so that we don't get this risk. But the highest, most complex institutions, such as banking, they don't run like this. They don't run as planners. They run as risk managers. That's why it's the largest portion of what bankings do when it comes to model risk management, managing their funds, portfolios, et cetera. All of that is through a management of risk, not planning for danger. And this is the way that we have to kind of integrate ourselves and what we know about time, and all of this stuff. So Lumen does a whole lot better job of unpacking it, but it's really good. And it does connect to theology, because his final book that he was writing before he died is his Sociology of Religion. It's a phenomenal book. He makes a lot of weird statements in it, but they're also like, he argues against atheists. He's like, atheists, you can't be sociologists of religion because you have no idea what you're doing. And then he says, religious people, you have to understand that when an atheist looks at you, they think of you as crazy, right? And it gets into some deep stuff. But to wrap this all around back into the final piece is this idea of surprise. There is this idea, it's called order from noise. People don't understand this. Okay, so people have order from disorder, but we don't have disorder, right? So going back to what you were talking about, we have order from noise. What is noise? Noise is the transjunctional operation, and people are going to be, what is that? It's transcendentally, it's conjunction of, and it's an operation that happens. So it's an action. So a transjunctional operation of order from noise is that we have order comes from the combination of order and disorder. So noise is order and disorder. We have to have a selection mechanism, and there is no selection mechanism without it being metaphysical, to choose the order from the disorder. And this is the biggest piece that people miss, is this is why atheists do not understand the Christian. excuse me, the atheist lives in a world of life and death. It's a binary. You and I do not live in a binary world. We cannot live in a binary world because we have life through our actions, operations, etc. We have this transjunctional operation of life or death. This transjunctional operation means that we do not live and see and invite the world in as a binary system. And only if you reject the binary can you open yourself up to the rest of it, right? Which goes all the way back to the very first piece of that whole work on trust and faith as the epistemic center. When you have trust, when you have faith, you get to open the self to the possibility of this transjunctional operation of life and death. Trust is the thing which binds and blinds the system so that we can reduce all of this complexity. Faith is the thing which allows us to reduce the complexity of reality. Because if we don't have faith, then everything is permissible.
Completely fantastic, Econ. So a bunch, you mentioned some of my favorite terms and ideas. Faith is courage. You know, I really like to stress faith as courage. Like the word faith in the Bible, like when Jesus talking all the time about courage, like faith can be thought as faithful. Like you can't have faith if you don't have courage. Like faith is not some sort of abstract dogma idea. It's literally courage. Like, and courage, one I think can strongly argue is tied to love. I don't think humans create courage without love. They certainly don't sustain it. They may have an act of like what's the difference between rashness or just kind of anger and courage? Courage is in love. Like courage and love go together because courage is a mode, I want to say a mode of being that's day in and day out, that is only sustained as itself in love. And that love then also is going to be necessarily tied to what you were saying just now on the selection mechanism that must be metaphysical. Because love is absolute, like, well, let's put it this way. Without a selection mechanism that's metaphysical, or without one that you have, I want to say, consciously chosen versus have chosen for you, then your selection mechanism will be perhaps preference or like or egotism or something like that. Right? Like in order to actually have the metaphysical selection mechanism be one that I want to say humanizes, makes us human, makes us persons, you know, with personhood, not just a corporation, then it's going to require love. Because love, as you're also pointing at, is epistemological. And you could even say onto-epistemological, because it will necessarily translate into the ontological. And without that love, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in your relation to that metaphysical selection mechanism to where it becomes habits alternative to the habits that are being incubated into you by the quote-unquote system, if you will, right? And you mentioned love as, yeah, you know, my beloved Michel Planier, personal knowledge, he's basically like, in tactile knowledge and all of his ideas, he's like, science requires love. And he's really, really concerned about, because he was a chemist, he could have won the Nobel Prize, he's brothers with Carl Planier, but Michel Planier really wanted to stress that there was this idea going around of science being this objective, impersonal gathering of the data and so on and so forth, and he's like, absolutely not. It is absolutely tied to a passion, and of course, the other great thinker on this, because this is, one could talk about this extensively. The other great thinker is of course, Paul Feyerabend in Against Method, where he is stressing that science, he's like, hey guys, y'all do know, it wasn't just religion who was questioning Galileo, but by the way, he's friends with the Pope, let's not forget that. The scientific community is questioning Galileo. Everyone is questioning Galileo, because he has a certain passion and a certain love and a belief in ideas that he's fighting for. And so Paul Feyerabend is like, this whole idea of truth, whatever, you know, being arrived at by some impersonal, emotionless, objective consensus is not true. And you could argue that fiction, in a bad sense, that now science, you could argue, in the last perhaps 50 years has tried to actually hold. It's one of the reasons science hasn't advanced in a long time. I mean, Sabrina just the other day was coming out, and obviously Weinstein, lots of people are saying physics and science has been in a dead end for a long time. It's kind of funny because it's almost as if science, this is kind of what I'm saying, science misunderstood its own history as being this objective, impersonal, passionless consensus. And it made itself in the image and likeness of this false understanding of its history. And so it's dead. It can't create any new ideas. It can't get any eureka. So it's really important to have good memory. But I would argue, and memory, of course, as Joachim will talk about, and is true, Augustine, Plato, Socrates, without memory, you're doomed. Like memory is at the center of, well, the human life. And without memory, you're certainly not going to be able to have a selection mechanism that's metaphysical that isn't done for you. Memory is very tied together. Love helps you remember. Love creates memory. Love also, Joachim's teaching on health, and he's saying that health is the gateway to metaphysics. Like you actually have to have health. Once you understand that health is not simply blood pressure, but it's relation, courage, relation, community, you can't have metaphysics without health. Because, and also you can't sustain a selection mechanism that's metaphysical, that is not smoked in like secondhand smoke from the system, without love. So love, memory, courage, these things are all tied together. And when you read a Paul Feyerabend, or you read a Michel Planier, or other thinkers, I like to talk about the modern counter-enlightenment, which is just my little thing. Because I think the counter-enlightenment, which you mentioned, the Scottish Enlightenment, and I know Isaiah Berlin comes up with this idea of this counter-enlightenment going against the continental enlightenment. There are some people who question that. They don't think it's a useful distinction. I do, because I think the Scottish Enlightenment, and this would be another topic that's very tempting to discuss, the Scottish Enlightenment has an entirely different idea of the relationality between what David Hume calls common life and philosophy. They do not believe in the possibility of what I would call autonomous rationality, which is rationality that is able to refer to itself without reference to anything outside of itself. And critically, David Hume is very concerned about philosophy that is not embedded in lived experience. He argues it will be the birth of totalitarianism and actually lead to total war. He doesn't know about world wars at this time, but he's predicting the possibility of an unleashed rationality. And he really is also, in my opinion, like you mentioned Kenneth Arrow and how love can deal with, the preference problem. David Hume, in my opinion, is a forerunner. Now, this is the part where I say something that all people like to say about philosophers they like, which is, I think David Hume is one of the most misread philosophers out there. I think he is reduced to an empiricist before empiricism is even a term. I don't think he's an empiricist at all. He's a defender of common life. He's not even a hard atheist. He just doesn't like philosophical atheism. He's going to Winford frickin' sermons. He's going to the sermons of the Great and Weight. He liked the religion of the blacksmith. He did not like the religion of the intellectual, because he said that is taking, he's saying that's taking religion out of people's lived life. And he says that's going to become a system of tyranny. But he's not just critiquing theology. He's concerned about philosophy doing that, where it becomes autonomous and separate. He didn't use these terms. He uses the term common life. It's relationality. It's all relationality. And he says, and then funny enough, this is my Hume moment. In the beginning of the Treatise of Human Nature, he says, if you separate philosophy from common life, and he also called philosophy that doesn't forget relationality is good philosophy, or true philosophy is the term, where bad philosophy is thought independent of relationality, okay? Or in service of a system that has set outcomes that are going to bend people to it because we know the good, quote unquote, right? That's bad philosophy or false philosophy. And he would use that same distinction for theology, economics, everything. And basically he says, if you make this mistake, he says there will be an unleash of what he calls philosophical melancholia. The term is melancholia, and it will spread around the world, and that's meaning crisis, nihilism, and everything. He says that's what's going to occur because you're not going to have care, right? So he's very concerned about that. And ultimately, it's all time to love in particularity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's way more to say on Michel Planier, David Hume, Scottish Enlightenment. And then what I think is, I think there is a thread that actually runs through the German Bildung, that continues the modern that continues the counter enlightenment through what I call the modern counter enlightenment. That there are actually thinkers like Michel Panier, Feyerabend, and I could go on, who were trying to keep alive this idea that you must have thought embedded in common life or we're dead, because because common life, basically what I was going to say, David Hume is pointing out various, I want to say, game theory problems that you end up in every day of the week when rationality is separated from relationality, common life, lived experience, particularity. Because rationality, independent of relationality, ends up in what I call rational impasses. They end up in ties. It's just a competition of coherence. Who has a coherent model? You bang them all together and you get a suboptimal result. The only way to break the tie is to bring the model into lived experience. But if you do that, the model turns out to be overfitting. It doesn't apply to all the particularity, so it doesn't work. So it has to be bottom up. So, and of course, Adam Smith and David Hume are very good friends. I very much appreciate your stress on the theory of moral sentiments or his work on jurisprudence. I mean, Adam Smith is absolutely assuming that when you talk about self-interest, it is going to be from an empathetic structure. And then, funny enough, David Hume and Adam Smith had debates on, they use different terms. And I think Hume used the term sympathy more so. They had these debates, but they both are agreeing that basically the market has to be unleashed in the context of a common life. Because when I have something in common with you, my self-interest is tied to your self-interest. And actually, we don't even know what is our self-interest independent, what is in our interest independent of that network, of embedded common life. So they completely agree on that. And if you separate capitalism from this reality, you have an autonomous rationality. You have a system that is its own self-justification that will necessarily flatten everything and compress everything to its own internal logic. And then, of course, you get meaninglessness because it becomes closed. It becomes operationally closed and thermodynamically closed, not operationally closed, thermodynamically opening, working to unveil and open up the operations more and more. What you were saying on roles, I could not agree more. I'll just quickly say that I always think about the loss of hobbies. The loss of hobbies have been a massive problem because hobbies, like, why did hobbies die? Because you're like, hey, I'm going to learn how to build tables. Why? Are you going to get paid? You're going to get a job? And so people didn't do it. Because if you couldn't justify it in terms of quantification, then people felt embarrassed. They stopped doing it, so they lost hobbies. Now, the only role people have is an occupation. But here's the problem. Occupations are not reliable signals. In the sense, if you work for a florist, I don't know if you're doing that to pay the bills or because you love flowers. And then if you say you love flowers, maybe you're just saying that because you've been trained by the habit. It's a Stockholm syndrome thing, right? Like, so when you do a hobby, when you're making tables and you're not getting paid for it, I know that says something about you that's special. That is a different kind of information because you are choosing to do this in your free time without coercion, right? So that creates an invitation of relationality that is not so reliable as the occupation. I mean, well, more things. The reliability, if you grant me this distinction between role and occupation simply for here, and I don't mean to say occupations can't also be roles, it depends on the context. When the economy is weak, when people have limited job options, when bills are high, then the reliability of occupation as an information source goes down, right? You need a robust economy in order for occupation to be reliable because there's a higher probability that the person has chosen, quote unquote, chosen this. Therefore, it is more reliable in what it may say about the person. But the loss of hobbies have been an insane problem. Also on this idea of compression for social intelligibility, for me, a distinction I make is there is a massive difference between the compression of the market to train you into a habit of utility versus the kind of compression of hospitality that I do when I first meet someone so that we can relate, and the hospitality then gradually opens, right? Like there is something like the hospitable person does not throw all of their stuff at a person they just met, right? They're not going to unload their emotional baggage, right? But the reason you're doing that is not because you feel like no one can receive you or it's anti-relationality. It's for the sake of relationality. So we could say there's a big difference between the unveiling of system compression per se, and the unveiling of hospitality, which is, but then hospitality is coordinated in particularity with the other person over time relative to what you learn about them in the relationality. So hospitality is a very big thing. The other thing I was going to, absolutely on the American cities, the other thing I was going to say, and I will warn you, Econ, I can keep you here for 5 hours. So please do not like, just go, if you've got it, don't let me keep you, but you're a gentleman. The other thing I was going to say on the selection mechanism must be metaphysical. This point cannot be overstated. So the thinker I used to make that point, inspired by the one who taught me everything I know on Leibniz, which is Anthony Morley in his book, Analysis of Citas, his work on analysis of citas. I also am a big fan of Austin Farah and his work on Leibniz from my beloved William Wilson. But what Leibniz wants to argue is all intelligibility ultimately requires a metaphysical judgment. You could call it a meta judgment if you grant me this phrase. So, because he asks the following, how do you determine similarity? Like when two things are similar. And this is the argument. He says two things are similar if you thought they were the same thing when apart. Okay? So the example he makes is, and I'm in a temple over here on this part of the earth, and I'm walking around in the temple, and I somehow end up in a different temple that I think actually while I'm inside of it, it's the same as the other. Like because it's similar, right? So much that I confuse them as the same, meaning I think there's only one, right? What Leibniz says, in order to identify that same things are not one but two, thus not the same, only similar, you have to bring them into the same situation. Like either mentally or geographically, like you bring them into the space. And what ends up happening is when you see the two temples that you thought were the same, or two apples, or whatever you want to say, you suddenly go, oh, I thought these were the same thing. They're actually two, not one, right? Huh. So you brought them into the same situation. Well, here's the question. What do you mean when you say they're similar? Like, where's the judgment that they are similar? Because they're not the same, they're different. Similarity is a term that is a testament to difference, but not, if they were totally different, there'd be no social intelligibility. You couldn't relate them at all. The only reason the two are able to relate and thus be two versus one and thus no relation is because they are similar. But the apples are not similar. They're not the same thing. You know what I mean? Like they're similar because you judge them as similar. So this is what Leibniz is saying. That's similarity is a metaphysical judgment. It's a meta judgment, if you grant that phrase, which is the selection mechanism that must be. And here's the other move. He's saying similarity is what basically everyone means in the classical mind when they talk about the forms. When they talk about forms, they're talking about the meta judgment of similarity. Like the form of the apples is that of which allows the intelligibility of seeing these two things are like one another in their difference. So form is the unity of similarity and difference, which only is possible metaphysically, because there are no two identical things in nature. It is a judgment of a subject in relation in order to make them intelligible. Because here's the point. Without similarity, there would be no intelligibility at all. You are always judging similarity. Like colors, white, like bookcases and doors, wood. Like similarity is present. A meta judgment is present in every single moment of intelligibility at all times. And then, of course, it begs the question, what is the source of this metaphysics? What does this mean? It would suggest, basically, Leibniz is also saying that you can't say that nature has no metaphysical basis, because the only way you're able to say that nature is intelligible to you is by a meta judgment of similarity that is not found in nature. You do not find similarity in nature. You find that in the judgment of the subject, right? So it is necessarily metaphysical. Now, here's the issue. I think, because like we're saying that there is in the free market, Scottish Enlightenment, small system, more anarchy, capitalism, et cetera, although there are different terms. There is this idea that basically that is the only way to have anti-fragility versus top-down, you're going to get different problems, right? The reason why relationality is necessary for capitalism and why libertarianism, in my opinion, is although I err on the side of small government, why it is erroneous is actually where, in my opinion, Marx is at his best at the very beginning of The Capital. And what he says at the beginning of The Capital is actually I think you can only understand it with Leibniz. is he asked the question of how, when you say this chair is worth 3 bushels of hay, he talks about linen a lot. So, he says like you have this chair is worth 3 things of linen. Where in nature do you find the equal sign? There's no equal sign. If I say this chair equals $20, this chair equals 3 linen or whatever, there's no equal sign in nature. I'm judging them. I'm adding a metaphysical judgment to reality, saying that this chair is worth $20. And $20, in terms of the abstract social use, is 3 bushels of hay or 5 things of linen, right? I've created a relationship between linen and the chair. I've created a relationship between the chair and $20, right? And so I've made a metaphysical judgment. The problem is that what Marx is pointing out, and I do think he's right on this, is we're trained into this single metaphysical judgment. Now, he doesn't call it a metaphysical judgment. We are trained into this single criteria of metaphysical selection, and we get in a habit of doing it that takes us out of the ability to relate to anything according to a different metaphysical judgment, like love or relationality or mystery or different things, right? And so what ends up happening is if capitalism, this is my point, if capitalism is separated from the community, it is very likely to have its meta judgment captured. It's going to be singularized. It's going to lose its dynamism. It's going to be reduced to, say, just utility or the commodity form, and you lose the ability to meta judge outside of that. Well, now we have a non-dynamic system, and that's why you get all of the inefficiencies of capitalism. Now, Marx then proceeds to present the famous labor theory of value and to suggest value correlates with labor. I have many things to say on this. I think that labor is a means of quantifying value, but value is not reducible to labor. And even if we predominantly use labor to quantify value, it would be a massive mistake to say that value is labor, in my opinion. Also, he makes a very important distinction that I think is overlooked, in that he says if you go out in a field and you dig a hole, that's not labor. That's just toil or something. Oh, wait a minute. This is a big deal. Because that means labor is a term that is necessarily sociological. The difference between labor and toil is socially conditioned. So labor can't be value if it is only going to quantify value under certain social conditions. And under different social conditions, you could have a different way to think about value, right? Say in the Christian church in terms of love, et cetera, so forth, right? So to me, what ends up happening, and I think Adam Smith and David Hume and these people were aware of this. I think they were very much aware of this. I'd have to make that argument. The problem is when capitalism is separated from the community, it tends to converge on a meta judgment. And of course, then it's nudgeable. There's incentive for the system to do this because I can nudge it. I can stimulate demand. One of the other things I like to say in economics is I really am not a fan of the conflation of stimulating demand and creating demand. These are very different. We have no idea how to create demand. We can stimulate demand, but creating demand, that's spiritual, that's metaphysical, that's creativity. And I would argue if we buy some of this idea of a certain stagnation, obviously the stagnation theory of Keynes or Cohn or other people, then that is tied to the tendency of capitalism, perhaps, when separated from community, to flatten the meta judgment into a non-dynamic interplay in an environment that thus kills creativity. Because ultimately, wealth is creativity. It's invention. It's not just freaking fiat currency. It's the ability to come up with air conditioning. And how do you do that? You get a dynamic system of people that can handle surprise, who have dynamic meta judgment, who can value things as important, even if there's no material basis to say it's important, because they have the meta judgment of that. And then the motivation, here's the key, the motivation that meta judgment creates in love, in courage. Because of course, economics, in my opinion, and I have so many more notes, but I'll give it back to you before I keep going, Econ, is that so much of the Scottish Enlightenment, in my opinion, is looking over at the, and I know the times are different, but they're basically saying, yeah, does philosophy have a good explanation for the problem of motivation? Like you say, well, we're motivated by the good. Are we? And even if we are, Is that a good thing? Because our idea of the good could be top-down tyranny or different things. You have this idea of how to deal with motivation in a manner that doesn't lose the particularity. And then, ta-da, you get an entire field of thinking about markets in a new way. And of course, there were always markets. We can look at Cortani. Capitalism doesn't invent markets, but it has a different, well, it has a different, I'll say, philosophy and notion of how the system should work. But motivation is the key because you have to motivate people. And if you want to motivate people, when people are trained into a single meta judgment, their motivation is tied to that meta judgment. And if that meta judgment is commodity form or quantity, then they will be motivated to create quantity. The problem is this is actually not theodynamically open because you're shrunk to a single meta judgment. It's not open. You need a mirad, an ability to move between meta judgments. I'm going to think about this as 20 bucks, but now I'm going to think about it as a creation of God's. Now I'm going to think about it as something that has the potential to strike me with beauty. Now I'm going to think about it as a gift. Right? You can move, but so I have that ability to move between the meta judgments. I have the skillfulness and the flexibility of thought to think about things according to different values. I mean, the problem is today, again, the reason hobbies died is because people are like, why would you do that if you can't make money off of it? Suggesting that there's something wrong with you to judge the thing as worth doing if you do it without getting money. So you're ashamed of your meta judgment. You're ashamed of a diversity of meta. So you close down. And then, of course, problematically, if there are people that want to nudge or that want to control or plan, it's fantastic if there's only one meta judgment because people are simpler. I've shrunken down variability to a manner where my central planning, my nudging is probably more effective. Yeah, but you've then metaphysically impoverished people, and when they are so metaphysically impoverished, they don't care. They lose meaning, and they especially won't care if the system breaks the social contract, if people don't feel like the economy is fair, they don't feel like they can get ahead, then they're really going to go against that meta judgment. But here's the problem. Then they're desperate because all they've ever been trained into is that meta judgment. They don't have the idea of there being an alternative. So now we're trapped. And in that, you're going to get social upheaval, violence, because you're trapped. You're the mouse in the Kafka story, a little fable. You can't get out. I have more. I'm gonna stop and give it back to you, Econ.
Hey, thank you, thank you. No, that's really awesome. First thing, going back to the beginning that you'd said about causality and life, right? One of the biggest pieces that I like to read on this idea was by Saint Nikolai Vilimarovich. He had a short paper. It's called "Causality is Personal." Right now, again, I'm not a personalist. I don't believe in personalism, but the idea here is that first, okay, we have energies, right? Energies are a natural manifestation, right? And so how how they formulate is personal. Now, for God, there's three persons. These persons have a certain level of identity and a certain level of distinction, and we'll go into that, but it's not as necessary. But just on a human level, right? So let's say there's a human energy of hunger, right? This is distinct between you and I. It's the same human energy. It's the same natural thing. Its expression is fundamentally different at a personal level. I get hungry, I'm going to go try to buy a bunch of pizza because that's what I do. I like pizza, right? You will like, I need a steak. So it's this same reality expressed in a different mode of being. And so causality necessarily is personal, right? And I think people don't understand this, and this especially goes back to what we were talking about on love being necessary for scientific inquiry and Firebrand and stuff like that. Is that if when you remove this idea of personal causality, you end up getting what you get in misunderstanding what quantum mechanics is on the observer, etc. Guess what? You've just related this whole idea as you continue moving forward that causality is personal.
Hmm.
So I think that this is really important. Um, on the idea of health, going back to some of the discussions with Jock, and I've had some discussions with him, right? And I think kind of the way that we end up getting roles, hobbies, and health all quantified or not quantified, all collaborated together is through sports, right? Like I think
Hmm.
the death of sports in the United States has had unknown consequences.
Mm.
And here's the thing. I know of people that their children are in sports. My daughter plays table tennis with me. We're at a club, right? Like we love it. It's a fun thing, and she takes it very serious. She wants to be professional. Now, in this, some parents, such as like the baseball parents, baseball kids parents, like I don't know if you know this, but there are thousands, millions of dollars being dumped into Little League baseball. It's insane. There are parents who are going out and buying $500 baseball, probably not that much, $300 baseball bats, $200 gloves. They're setting up traveling teams. They're doing all of it. It's an absurd unreality of what baseball is and its ability to be a relational sport. It's the competition drives more than the experience of the love for the game and the love for the other, and it like totally destroys what it is. And so I know when I first started with it, I would buy paddles for myself, right? So I put together my own paddles. I like to experiment. I'm just open to this. And so I like, oh, what does this rubber do? What does this sponge? How's this wood? Right. And so I like learning about all the mathematics of exit velocity, spin mechanics, etc. Right. And so I'm just making a bunch of random paddles and my daughter's trying them all. She's pretty new. I'm pretty new. These paddles are totally unnecessary for us, right? But we're doing it, right? So we're spending money, but I'm just trying to have fun, experiment scientifically. But to her, and this is what ended up happening to her, she started going through this idea that, oh, well, I have to be a paddle and integrate with this paddle, and the more expensive, the better. And then I was like, okay, I'm putting a stop to this. You get a mid-level, run-of-the-mill store paddle. This is what you're going to train with for quite some time because, hey, you need to learn to love the game, learn to love the movement, learn to love yourself, learn to love the other, and you need to integrate yourself through this. You don't just need to go, I just need a better paddle. Like,
Right.
that's stupid. That misses the whole point of having fun in the game. And this is the thing that I see with all the other kids in sports, and it aggravates me to no end because it's like parents don't want to parent. And this is sad reality. Parents don't want to parent. They really just want to push their kids into something and like, oh, well, I have a coach, so I don't have to do that. Right. I didn't start playing table tennis until my daughter wanted to do it. And then I was like, she wants to be a pro because she watched a couple YouTube videos. Well, guess what? I have to go learn how to do it. I have to spend my hours, being autistic on learning everything about it because I want to be the journey with her because I'm her parent.
Right.
People just want to just shove their kids and do things. Go, 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 win, win, win. What are you doing? You're missing the whole point. Parenting is being with your child, to live with your child, to unlock your child with your child. It's simple, but yet it's so unnecessarily forgotten in this world that it blows my mind. I go to playgrounds and parks. And I always feel so awkward because I'm the only dad out there. I'm playing with all the kids. Hey, I'm on the jungle gym. I'm doing this. I'm getting all the kids to do pull-ups and stuff. I'm throwing the kids, etc. Like, and all the other parents are just sitting there having their cookout and like, okay, y'all are doing your thing. You're having your fun with your friends, but like, come on. Like you can integrate between the two. You need to be there. Your children want you to interact. And guess what? Hey, if you want to make friends, going out and interacting with the other persons there, interacting, hey, things get a lot better. There's a lot more love to be held around in this regard. We need to start doing this, right? And I know this got way connected, but the point is like when we talk about this health, guess what? You can play a sport. This is going to keep you healthy. It's going to keep you driven. It's going to give you internal and intrinsic motivation. You get to have fun and you get to have love and you get to be serious in many ways. You can be serious. Yes, it's fun. There are times and places I tell my daughter, hey, we're training today. Guess what? We'll do 30 minutes of serious time. If you go hard and you're doing serious, you're working on, your steps, your moves, your strokes, and things of that nature. Cool. When you're done with that, hey, we can just play around and have fun. But we have to be serious first. Right.
Mhm.
And this is the key that
Yeah.
people again they miss. They want to either be too fun or too serious. You have to have both.
Yep.
And this goes back to everything that we said earlier, right? And okay, so Hume, I'm open to being persuaded by this. I actually dislike Hume on several levels. But I will say, to be fair, I'm also a big fan of Descartes and Machiavelli. And those are two people who are lambasted in philosophy for, I think, being misread. Again, Niccolo Machiavelli, right? Oh, the prince, he's evil. No, he wrote that for papists to understand the instantiation of power to princes. If you read his discourses on Livy, it's just
Mm.
a dynamic exploration of what's going on and his discussion on civic virtue as a necessity.
Yeah.
Civic virtue. Stop looking at the king to be better than you.
Right.
Be better yourself, right? And he and everybody's always anti-religious, but he also says things like society would be a whole lot better if everybody lived like St. Francis Assisi, right? Like
Mm.
the world would be better if you did that, right? And so when we look at him and say he's evil because he wrote, the prince, please understand that there's a lot more going on there. Same with
Right.
Descartes. Oh, Descartes was evil. He thought about dualism. Like, yeah, but he also was a devout Christian, and he thought the only way to instantiate reality in his cogito ergo sum was to actually know that the other exists. It's
Right.
not that he found himself. This is a bad interpretation of what's going on. He doesn't go, I think, therefore I am. He goes, you know, I think, therefore I am, and I can only am and think because God.
Yeah.
So his first principle is not the self. His first
Relation.
principle is God.
Yeah.
It's it's mind blowing that people like
Yeah.
miss that whole bit just to take I think therefore I am as his magnum opus, or
Right.
that he was a skeptic. He wasn't a skeptic. He didn't believe in skepticism. He just used skepticism to show the skeptics that they didn't know what they were doing, because
Right.
the more they denied, they just ended up to a point of non-infinite regress, to a place of how do we know reality? Well, I know it because I can think, and I can only think because God exists. Therefore, God exists. That's his ontological argument,
Right.
right? So people like piece him apart. So I totally get what you mean with Hume.
Yeah.
But yeah, Hume and the common life and the common sense philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment is again, it's downplayed in modern society. People look at it and go, oh well, Adam Smith just cared about self-interest. Hume was someone who thought virtue was something that was totally unnecessary, that we can be driven
Right.
by our senses and incentives, and that we ought to motivate ourselves towards a goal without understanding the transcendental, which I think that still ends up being his critique. My critique of him is that he wants to try to have a transcendental without a grounding in the transcendental. But again, I'm open. I haven't read him as
Sure.
much as I have Adam Smith. I'm open to persuasion, but that's my reading.
Sure.
But all of this, and the hospitality idea, I love that. I'm not really going to talk into it, but there is the Leibniz connection, right? So first of all, Leibniz is the godfather of cybernetics. People don't know this, but if you read any of the early cyberneticians, guess what? Hey, it comes all about Leibniz's work.
Yeah.
Now, Leibniz is awesome. Leibniz is also heavily indebted to, I think they're called the Rhineland mystics, such
Yeah.
as Hildegard von
Yeah.
Bingen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
People don't make this connection. Prior to Hildegard von Bingen, there was no Western conception of a life force per se. And only until Hildegard von Bingen, leading into Leibniz, do we get this idea of life force, Mortiva force, and all the other forces that interact. Now, she called it the greening force, which was green is life, right? If you come from the Rhineland of Germany, it's a very green place. Farming, etc. These are primary themes in Christianity that people don't unpack. Your job as a Christian is to be a farmer, just first and foremost. This is the first task God ever gave to mankind, was to be a farmer. So to be a farmer and to do this and to live in this greening force, which is the connection that Hildegard von Bingen makes, which is then picked up into the scientific exploration of metaphysics through Leibniz, right? Like this force of reality is the point, right? And then connecting to the idea of similitude and similarity as necessary for difference. The person that I think that expresses this most is Nicholas of Cusa,
Hmm.
right? People really need to read Nicholas of Cusa, because he made this idea, and he said God creates by distinction.
Hmm.
Just when people try to unpack like Luhmann's work on unity and distinction, and how we have to exist in our social system through our distinct mechanisms, right? Our distinct roles. And we're like, well, how do we get to this unification, right? The unification comes from the highest order of being, right? So you and I are unified in our humanity, right? So the unity is always upward in this
Yeah.
motion, right? And the distinctions are always downward in its flow. So God creates by distinctions. Now, this is very Neoplatonic in many ways. He was influenced by Gemistus Platon. But at the end of the day, this is not something that you wouldn't read from St. Maximus the Confessor, who says that existence is a set of distinctions, and man is the microcosm of the macrocosm, right? Which means man is distinct within his being, and God, by his distinctions, sets up reality, which is why we don't deny the divine distinctions within the Godhead,
Right.
which is why we, again, this is one of the big battles between the East and the West, and understanding, the West is going to overanalyze the unity, and the East is going to extend this into, well, reality is instantiated through our distinctions.
Yeah.
God is the reality of distinctions
Yes.
through his own
Yeah.
distinctions, right? So this is exactly what you get when you read, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite. And anyway, so I think that that's an important understanding to the unity of identity and difference when it comes to reading Leibniz, is also reading him within this understanding of Cusa, because I think he did read him. He's heavily relating the work of Scotus. So did Descartes.
Yeah.
They're both working from this Scotistic framework and this mystical frame from Hildegard von Bingen. And I think that this is really what unpacks all of this. And then the idea of like the no equal sign in creation from Marx.
Mm.
And this is one of those things where it's like Marx wasn't nearly as bad as Marx was, but Marx was bad in what Marx does. Marx is true.
Mm.
Marx's arguments here is true, just like Marx's arguments in monetary theory are pretty true. Marx's arguments on the destruction of role theory, right? Because again, we're working from this idea that we have this breakdown of civilization because people are no longer tied to a role.
Right.
Especially like, just think about, oh, well, we don't have people who grow up and become blacksmiths because their parents are blacksmiths. It happens, but not nearly as frequently. And so I was going to a physical therapist the other day, and they had their 1-year-old running around. Now I have 3 daughters, and one of them is a 1-year-old. These two babies. They're pretty similar to one another. They love each other, actually. They're friends, right? And their little child is running around, and they're like, "Hey, I'm so sorry. I hope you're okay with this." And I just thought to myself, why would anyone ever apologize? One, it's an adorable running around, and two, this is the way it ought to be. We've gotten to a place in our society that we want to try to um, motivate kids to go somewhere else, and it's just like, no, no, you need to be with the parent. Like, you need to do these things. That's how you explore reality. That's how you look at the world. Like, hey, look at what I do. That way kids actually understand what's going on rather than just thinking in the world in abstraction, right? This grounds them in their being to know who their parents are in that role. And so I think that what he says here, what Mark says, is that we have this consistent amount of distinctions within our life of, oh, I work this job and this job is distinct from this job, so on and so forth, right? Like, this division of labor ends up causing a lot of harm to us. But at the same time, the division of labor allows us to relate to one another. And I think he points out all the negativity properly. But I think, and this is what I've always led to being a critique of him, because I grew up a diehard uh communist, right? Like, I read all of that, and I was a huge communist, right? But what I ended up figuring out is that he misses the positive aspect of the division of labor, which is our ability to better relate to one another through our distinctions, right? And this is ends up being the biggest critique that Nicholas Luhmann has for Karl Marx, is that, hey, Karl Marx, you're correct here, but you're missing it, that we become unified in our distinctions,
Yep.
right? Because, hey, if we get to a point in time in our world where we are so distinct that there is no relationality between us. The fact that we are so distinct will then become the thing which relates us. That's like a mind-blowing proposition, but if you really think about it, if I can't relate to someone because we share nothing in common, we could honestly start with the joke that, hey, we share nothing in common. That creates the unity for that dialogical reciprocity. And I think this is the key to thinking about it there as well. Like, just because these jobs become consistently distinct and disparate, that doesn't mean that there's no longer mechanical or organic solidarity, to touch on Durkheim or on Weber, that there's not an undergirding spirit of capitalism for him, but just a spirit in general that binds and blinds, to use the term from Jonathan Haidt. I know I'm slapping out names here, but I'm just trying to bring all this complexity in, that it's not just my idea here, but really there is something that is, again, metaphysical, that allows for this entrenchment of all of these distinctions to be true, which is why I go back to Nicholas of Cusa and to St. Maximus the Confessor to say that, hey, all of these distinctions end up leading to the unity that we all believe in. So anyway, to point through that, and then the labor theory of value, social conditions and values and incentives. Yeah, obviously these things are socially constructed. Like social construction is, everybody thinks, oh, that's a bad word, it's socially constructed. No, it's perfectly fine to say that things are socially constructed. They are. Things are socially constructed. However, comma, pause for effect, let me blow you in place. Social construction doesn't necessarily mean it's not real.
Right.
Yeah. People need to read Wittgenstein, right? Just because something is socially constructed does not deny its reality in general, right? But the problem is, as you pointed out, which is, to wrap this all around, we've gotten to the point of singularity in our meta judgment. And so there's two things here. This is people pushing Ashby's law of requisite variety. So Ashby's law of requisite variety, it says you need a certain amount of variety by a regulator to regulate the variety of a system. So why this matters? So let's take banking as an example. Banking and banking regulation. So banks have to be regulated because they take on risk, etc. How as a government body to regulate, or even non-governmental body, regulate a bank when banks are all having their own distinct ways of doing things, etc., their own distinct risk tolerance? It becomes almost impossible, because the government as a single entity only has enough variety really to technically deal with one or two other systems. So if we force all of the other systems into conformity, then we have enough requisite variety to deal with their variety, because the variety has been limited by rules. All of this is perfectly reasonable to understand, and perfectly reasonable to think that we need, going back to what we were talking about regulation of society through rules. The problem then becomes is that systems always tend toward isomorphism, which means they always basically become the same. Isomorphism is not sustainable, because once you stop having those distinctions, you start having the collapse of the system, because it wants to distinguish itself in general. And if it can't distinguish itself, then it dies, because it lacks creativity and it lacks love, because love is the creative force. So boom, now we've wrapped this all around, and we connect this back into the regulation of people in our days and our lives, where the government is trying to reduce the amount of variety within the population, which leads to the isomorphism of the population, going back into what we were talking about, roles theory, about how they've been compressed by social media, going back into what we were talking about the unveiling and the veiling, where people are now, they have to close themselves off because they are ripped open by society and the measures of society and the government, where people then close themselves off to the point that they are no longer an authentic reality. They no longer have creativity. They no longer can do scientific inquiry. They no longer have the ability to actualize what exists through love, through virtue. And all of this leads into the final statement that when we say that this meta judgment has become singular and so on and so forth, there is a really bad economist who come up with this idea of growth pole theory. And growth pole theory basically says that, hey, we start with a centralized place. Like, let's take a major metropolitan city, New York. New York then becomes like this hubbub, and in it, it starts motivating poles. So these poles are poles of power, feedback, and feed through mechanisms, so on and so forth. But we still have that main growth pole, and it has all of its necessary connections. Well, there was this guy, Harold Ennis, who wrote about communications theory back in the day. And he said, okay, what ends up happening is that a culture, a empire, ends up instantiating one type of communication over all the others. What ends up happening is all of those other places that want to use their communications, well, they start having to build power on the outside of that growth pole, of that empire, of that main communication branch. So how do we end up dealing with this problem? Eventually, one of those poles on the outside will end up taking on enough power to challenge the other through its own communicative paradigm. And then you have the collapse of that empire and the rising up of another one based on a different communication paradigm. Now, you wrap all of these back together, well, you get into a place where society has a singular, incoherent, but to itself internally coherent communicative mechanism of meta judgment.
Yep.
And what you have and what you've seen and what everybody can see, unless you're blind, is that there is a new paradigm shift, to use those terms, of this metacommunicative system that's going to overtake the system as it exists right now. Why do people think right now we are having the great revival of the ancient apostolic faiths? And it's not just Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy in the United States is growing. It's not just Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism is growing. Roman Catholicism, for the first time in like 100 years, or not 100 years, since JFK, have they become a big part of the voting mass.
Yeah.
Usually they voted Democrat. This is the first time they voted Republican for Donald Trump, right? We can see this shift of what's going on in the communicative paradigm. We also see a growth in Oriental Orthodoxy, all of these old churches, because they have aesthetic, they have canonicity, meaning they have their own sections rules that people have to live by, which allows people to live in a world that reduces the complexity before it gets to them. They have roles that they have within the church, so they then have a place to have this compartmentalization. They also have a place that they can open themselves through confession, because Protestant churches do not have confession. So you have a place to have your openness. And then you also have a place that you can hide, because you're now no longer bound by the world to exist the way the world wants you to exist. So now you have the hidden world.
Right.
So this providence that I would say, this providence of God when it comes to the judgment of nations and peoples, is built like this. And we've seen this happen over and over and over in history. In fact, this is the basis for my doctoral dissertation on my law of requisite virtue, which means that a system requires a set amount of virtue to interact at a rational and sociable level.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so all of this ties back into everything that we've discussed, and how society, as it moves forward towards this apostolic reality, moving towards this canonicity, this reality that we now have motivating itself, moving through, this is going to be the thing, hopefully, that overtakes the system and allows for that requisite virtue to be brought back into the system, to keep it from actual collapse and people actually dying, because we're moving closer and closer to this border of a collapse of requisite virtue in our society. We've seen it in the Bolsheviks, we've seen it in the French Revolution, we've seen the opposite happen in the founding of the United States, right? We're now at that point in our own civilization. The Byzantine Empire, that's a big one that point to. We've seen the lack of requisite virtue that ended up happening prior to with orthodoxy turning back in on itself, so on and so forth. The emperors giving up all of their power to the West, etc. This collapse of the virtue field. And so, yeah, hopefully, and I do believe that this is the case, that through God's providence and his judgment of the people, that we're getting to that place that we will overcome these issues through this modification of our meta judgment.
Absolutely magnificent. Everything you said was so good. Fantastic. And Econ, I probably will need to help get lunch for the children in a little bit. We still have more time. I don't want this to end. I've enjoyed every second of it. First, I agree completely with what you're saying on sports. Um, and also the replace what's also to me terrible is the replacement of sports by the watching of sports, which can make it seem like your society cares about sports. But sports is not something you as parents do. You have other people do it and you mostly watch it. This is not good because I think, as Jockin stresses, there's something about sports that actually trains virtue in situation. Like these things go together. This is terrible. Michelle, what you said on parenting, I could not agree more. Michelle and I discuss this all the time. It is a dire thing, and we exist in a society where kids go away. You push them away, the great outsourcing. And Ivan Illich, who I'm a big fan of, he aligned this with the disablement of the society. We're disabled from being parents, but we think this is the key to disablement. We think we're enabled because we have someone else do it, and when they come back, it makes it look like we did it. In the same way that he says we're disabled from getting our own food now because we can go to the store, so we don't know we're disabled, right? And that this disablement, which comes with pluses and minuses, leads to a less virtuous society and one that ultimately can't handle, well, struggle. And ultimately, when you're disabled, when you encounter difficulty, which inevitably occurs when you encounter the other, that could be an invitation to growth and development and love. But if you can't handle it, you exit. It's like Jock and I will say, if you either engage or you exit. And when everyone is disabled, they exit. I think people outsource their children because it's too difficult to figure out how to relate to them. So I won't. And there's many, many problems that come with that. What you were saying about God as the making of distinction, yet he is distinct. The phrase you use on the idea, the reality of distinction. So it's that unity of distinction that in his being, distinction is down, unity is up. Meta judgments are up. Meta judgments are how you bring, and I would link meta judgment with what you were saying on the communication paradigm. I believe those are two sides of the same coin. So if we do not, in a sense, own our meta judgment, like we're conscious of it, we're aware of it, we make a point to train it, we make a point to join communities where it can diversify from the omnipresent meta judgment of, say, utility, then the way that things move together will be outside of our control. It will be in, say, service of the system or the people doing the nudges. And we will be unified in a way that may, well, not sufficiently or adequately honor our distinction. And then we will lose meaning and we will not care. And once that occurs, you get all sorts of trouble. The question of the meta judgment is how things are going to move together. And I strongly like what you were saying on, at a point of radical difference, you'd still have a similarity. True, what I call total difference is an isolated point. Like, you don't actually have total difference in every sense of the word unless you have a point in a black hole, which, of course, there are no such things as points. This is very important. Points don't exist. There's only relation, right? Like, a phrase, without going into detail, a phrase I like to use all the time, if you just grant it to me here, is that geometry is discovered, algebra is created. And I think that's one of the reasons we're so confused in mathematics, is because algebra is created to the degree it can fit back, is discovered to the degree it can be fit back into geometry, and it is created to the degree it is not capable of doing that, right? And so you can obviously imagine algebra or points or numbers independent of quality, but they're imagined, and they only can be perhaps useful maps to the degree they can be brought back into geometry. But if they're independent of geometry, you get an entire mess. And of course, one of the reasons why arguably science has stagnated so badly is because it is based on models in mathematics that cannot necessarily be brought back into geometry that can be experienced in relationality versus imagination. And so that's going to create coherence and seemingly progress, and you can even write papers, but it's created. That could be problematic.
I hate to jump in. Um, one quick thing. One of the biggest criticisms that St. Gregory Palamas labels against the West and the Latins and how they understand distinctions in essence and energy distinction is actually by geometry. He considers geometry to be very sacred, and he thinks that the West lacks the understanding of proper geometry and like Stoic logic to actually understand why there is these meta distinctions and metaphysical distinctions in God, right? So, just so we're clear, that does always connect back to the theological point.
Yes, Trinity is geometry. I love that. Magnificent. I think the West has been horrible on geometry in this sense. Leibniz, funny enough, suggested that metaphysics should be metageometry. Like it actually should be called metageometry. That metaphysics was that has always been a term that has confused people because, it obviously means next to the physics section in the Library of Alexander, but also metaphysics and metaphysician. So you have this double with you're a physicist, but are you a doctor? What's going on? There's this kind of confusion between the metaphysics and the metaphysician. Well, the idea is that there's something about metaphysics that increases health, but it's also tied to the physical world. It's not just imaginations. And I think metageometry starts kind of pointing in this kind of mixture of the physician and the physicist per se. But I love what you were just saying. Meta judgment, the best way a system. And I also will just say, Pavio is wonderful on Descartes. I loved everything you said on Descartes. I think he is radically misunderstood as well. I am no expert on Machiavelli, but I have always appreciate people who bring nuance to him, and I have been convinced there's far more to Machiavelli. I have a stack of books. What I do is with projects, I have stacks of books that say, when you get to that project, do that. And all of the works on Machiavelli is like, when I get to belonging in 3-3, go over there. Okay, because there's not enough time in the day. But I am absolutely convinced that Machiavelli is misread. And Descartes is absolutely misread. I very much appreciate that. What I was going to say is also I wanted to say that risk versus danger distinction is gold. That is magnificent. And I love what you said on order from noise the order from noise is a very important idea. And you can only do that with a metaphysical selection mechanism. And if you don't do that, then you're trying to get rid of noise, which then flattens. And also there's no such thing as pure noise because there's no such thing as non-relation at all unless it's an imagined point in a vacuum. So what you call noise must be an othering then. Someone must decide what is noise relative to their judgment, which is going to, of course, top down, limit diversity and all sorts of issues. So I love that. I also entirely agree that Leibniz is the godfather of cybernetics, and I really appreciate many more of the great philosophers are inspired by mystics than people realize. Often philosophers are kind of, to put it very simplistically, there's always that kind of simplistic idea that all truth is God's truth. And if it is true in theology, it thus must be true in all fields, just maybe by different meta languages. And you can often kind of see this interesting thing where philosophers will take mystical insight and say, well, if that is true, then actually through non-mystical communication paradigms or non-mystical will actually arrive at the same conclusions. And philosophy has been way more influenced by mysticism than is often acknowledged. And I think that has been a major problem. Because when you do that, the way sometimes I language it is that rationality must always be in relation with non-rationality, that which is not reducible to a rational calculus. Otherwise, it becomes autonomous and eats itself. It becomes one of my favorite words, auto-cannibalistic, self-cannibalism. I love that term. Basically, I think of a lot of cybernetical thinking as, how do we avoid auto-cannibalism? How do we do that? When everything, like you said, systems tend toward isomorphic. Everything tends toward auto-cannibalism if you don't check it. If you don't, if you're not intentional about it. If you don't, let me put it this way. I didn't comment on this, and I think this is so important. Personal causation, all causation is personal. To the degree that you deny this or fail to adequately inject diverse personal causation into the system, it's going to auto-cannibalize. It's going to isomorphize and it's going to eat itself in entrapment. 100%. Couldn't agree more. If you wanted to control the system, a very effective way to do it, to control people, if you just capture people, is to basically reduce their meta judgment capacity, to reduce it to a single communicative paradigm. Because then you can, hey guys, if I want to control you, once I get you all habituated into a single meta judgment, y'all go do what you want. I don't care anymore because you're no longer a threat to me because you're in the tract, right? And so meta judgment is a subtle way to make it look as if there's diversity per se, when there isn't. And this makes me think of all my beloved sociologists like Berger, Hunter, Reef, et cetera, so forth. And what they were all warning about, they were actually, funny enough, in the 90s warning against multiculturalism versus what they would call pluralism. And multiculturalism is the idea that we're all different, but at the end of the day, we're the same human beings. You know, we have different foods. And he's like, no, we're not. That's really dangerous. Like, difference is all the way down. If it is not all the way down, then you're going to flatten people. And actually, difference being all the way down, now, of course, the counter to the sociologists, if you say that, then we're all going to be isolated in our difference and we're not going to be able to relate. Well, they said, but this is the challenge for them, this is the work of sociology. To think the problem of acknowledging that difference is different, that difference is real without losing social intelligibility. To me, cybernetics in sociology, when it's doing what it's supposed to do, are actually incredibly tied together. They're very strongly connected. And if you lose that, you get in trouble. But what they were saying is that multiculturalism as a paradigm, which is ultimately just serving a single meta judgment of the commodity form, is ultimately what it does. It's Francis Fukuyama, et cetera, so forth. Is that what they said is if you do that, people are going, well, they didn't use this language. Peter Berger did. It's like, it's going to create nihilism. Because people are going to be disconnected from the root of their difference in identity, of what makes them them. They're going to feel like they're not allowed to bring it to the public square or to the market. And eventually there will be a popularist backlash. There will be, and people are going to reject that. That's going to be a problem. So the question is the following. Okay, then what we need is a certain skillfulness in meta judgment. A certain skillfulness in the ability to move between meta judgments, and we can relate in having various meta judgments that we can move between, right? And we have the ability to meet one another, right? That's what you have to do. But we don't have a society that does it. And I also, and I could say so much more, but I'll give it to you for any thoughts. And what you said about the church being a kind of hiding place, like a kind of separate from the world. Well, then it can incubate different meta judgments. And thus, when you go, you can introduce a diversity of meta judgment. Because the name of the game, for me, it's basically always coming down to the question of sufficient relationality versus autonomousness. Like if it is autonomous, you got a trouble. What is autonomous or thinks of itself? Of course, it's not actually autonomous, but that positions itself as autonomous, entrapped, is autocannibalism. And sufficient openness is relationality, and that creates energy, and that creates dynamism, et cetera, so forth, right? So when you ultimately, to get sufficient diversity, you must have diversity in meta judgment. You must have the ability to judge things according to different ways of unifying them together. Because if God himself is a unity of diversity per se, it's a coming together of diversity, then multiple meta judgments are you can bring things up into the diversity of God and his unity in a diverse way, which is what one would expect is fitting for God's person as Trinity, right? Like if there were, and so that's fitting, right? Well, then you need places that can habituate those things. And then of course, virtue, and I'll have to read your work on what you're doing. For me, virtue is tied to the capacity to move between spaces of meta judgment and not lose your diversity. Like without virtue, you're not able to move through the society and sustain yourself in the diversity of your meta judgment. Because it goes back to what you were saying, operationally closed, thermodynamically open, right? So in a way, God, in his operational closedness, is actually not closed. That's what's interesting, because he's communal, right? Like a communal ontology, as can be said. Trey will talk about. So how does a human being, in our very Danielness, etc., have a certain communal ontology, right? Well, we have to maintain a certain diversity in our very unity, right? That the sufficient level of closeness must be based on virtue. If it is based on anything else, it will be closed off. What your virtue is like, I have standards. Courage versus fear. I am closed to being afraid. I am closed, quote unquote, to lying. I am closed to the possibility of relating to the other in a manner that contributes to auto cannibalism, right? So, what you're doing in virtue is you're using operational closeness in service of the openness. And you're closed to that which closed down the openness, but you're also closed to being bulldozered or manipulated in a manner that makes you non-relational when, say, you think you are, or self-deceived, or so on and so forth. So virtue has this skillfulness of how to be closed for the sake of openness. In the same way that there's a certain closeness of the Trinity, say, to vice, or to that which is not God, that is not holy, right? But this closeness is actually a testament to openness, because if it allowed these things into itself, it actually could not be open. So virtue is keeping the things out of you that closes you off, right? And so there's that kind of contradictory move that is not a logical contradiction. It makes sense in practice, right? Without virtue, you cannot have the proper operational closeness that does not shut down theodynamic openness. And if you don't have theodynamic openness, the system dies, and you're not, and you're going to run out of energy. But if you don't have enough closeness, as we've already said with the unveiling, well, then there's no social intelligibility at all, right? Virtue is the grounds of social intelligibility that is able to strike this bifitting, per se. And if we don't have that, we've got issues. And then, of course, to allude, and I'll give it to you, to allude to Jock, and then we get into the strike of beauty, the relation of beauty to virtue, verse, and how these things kind of go together in the way that we describe it. But I will give it to you, my dear friend. So let me throw, I've really enjoyed this. Any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick on this idea of the necessity of virtue, because this is something that philosophers and literaticians, I guess you could call them, have brought up. Like, oh, for example, C.S. Lewis, the necessity of chivalry. Chivalry is a virtuous reality, one that's not natural into man's fallenness, but one that is habituated through participation. People really fail to recognize, as you just laid out, this whole idea of the closeness of the system requires something that closes it. And like you said, we have this necessity of virtue here. And primarily there is a Saint Diodocus, and he says the highest virtue is discernment.
Mm,
And the way people should think about this from a theological perspective, what was the thing that caused the fall, right? Like that was because Adam didn't discern on whether or not he should eat the apple,
mm,
well, apple, fruit, whatever. And same with Eve, right? They didn't discern what was. And so when they partook of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, well, now they have evil. And what that means is they can choose to not do. So in the beginning, Adam is young, Adam is dumb. People fail to realize it's Adam is like less than like 24 hours old, right? Like imagine giving a baby an idea of what to do and not to do, right? Like there's no cultivation of what's proper. There's a snake going, hey, you can eat this. Don't listen to that guy. And he's like, okay, whatever. Right. So like, but once they get to the point of the knowledge of good and evil, which is required for man, a lot of the saints talk about this. It's required of man
yeah,
to have the knowledge of good and evil. It's just not at that time.
right.
Adam was not prepared. And so what ends up happening, or say, so we have the knowledge of good and evil. Discernment then becomes how we choose between good and evil. I have to reject evil. I have to reject the things that are trying to impart their messaging, their beliefs on myself, which ties all the way back to the very beginning on nudges and how they're problematic because I don't have the ability to discern. I don't have an authentic representation of how I should be able to choose because someone thinks that my discernment isn't good. And if my discernment isn't good, then I can't have my salvation. No one
Right.
can drag you to heaven. You have to be able to discern this upon
Hmm.
yourself. Like, and people just, they just don't want to think about this. But seriously, think for just a moment. If someone told you to do everything throughout your life, example, taxes. I'm okay with taxes. I'm okay with taxes. All right. What if we radically went to everyone who was wealthy and just stripped all of their wealth away and gave it to the poor? Well, who's going to be saved in that instance? Who has salvation? Those people who are poor, they're not getting salvation because they've had some extrinsic force
Right.
act on their behalf. The rich people, they're not going to get salvation. They didn't willingly
Yeah.
give this up. They didn't promote charity or anything. They were just taken from what they had. So all you've done is just removed everyone's ability to have salvation because the sufferer has salvation through their suffering. They can rely upon God to know the truth, etc., right? But then we have the rich man. The rich man has the poor person for suffering. He's supposed to give unto them. If we remove that choice, then the rich man no
Yeah.
longer has salvation. And so what you end up getting is you get this system of closed reality that no one is saved because everyone or no one has the ability to discern
Right.
what is good and what is evil. So we're back at the point where we're ignorant Adam being tricked by the devil to do the bad
Mm.
thing or even the good thing. But still, we were supposed to eat the apple. It's not a negative thing that
Mm.
we ate the fruit. The
Mm.
negativity comes as the fact that we didn't discern properly and that we disobeyed God.
Mm.
But that's because we didn't have the ability to discern in the proper way. So again, tying this all back up, discernment, this principle of prudence, as you could call it, from the ideas of virtues, this is something that has to be habituated. As Saint Maximus the Confessor says, every person who participates in virtue as a matter of habit unquestionably participates in God, the substance of the virtues. And God is our enclosement because God is what opens us, like in a true sense,
Right.
like the Holy Spirit is the openness to reality, going back to Descartes. But God is also the enclosement. So
Hmm.
I can't close my mind off to the evil things of this world. How many people here think that they can actually stop doing stuff? People who deal with problems of pornography, people who deal with problems of drug addiction, stuff like that. They can't stop that. There's no discernment. The process of discernment has been cut off. Neurologically, even if we just remiss with all of the theological underpinning, neurologically, those subsystems have overgrown the central nervous system and have become the primary movers of that central nervous system, right? Like any habituation that happens prior to that dopaminergic increase is going to overtake the system where they're going to seek that out, even if they don't want. They logically, consciously do not want to do drugs. And then they go through step X, Y, that concludes with Z because that central nervous system, that whole neurological frame has led them to that. They are dominated by that neurological system. And so they no longer have discernment, right? And that's why God calls it given over to the reprobate mind. He has there's a full understanding and explication of this in the Holy Scripture. Again, that needs to be referenced more often in our discussion with psychology as Christians, especially Orthodox, to come to this because again, prudence discernment is what operationally closes the mind because God is the binding of that operational closure. And our openness is allowing us what to have those relations, to have the authenticity. The authenticity allows us to know ourselves. By knowing ourselves, we come to know God because God dwells in us. And that, again, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I have to know myself before I can know God. And I only know God by learning to know myself because I participate
Yeah.
in the
Right.
virtues, which God is the substance of the virtues.
Right.
This is This is laid out by Saint Nectarios in volume 7 of his completed works. It's called Know Thyself. It's, again, a lot of people hold this idea of uh, and I wouldn't say necessarily Lacanian, but Jungian,
Sure.
on the introspection of the self and the archetypes and stuff like that. Like, this misses the point of knowing the self. The knowing the self isn't to find these hidden depths, these misunderstood mysteries of reality, is to know ourselves in our true being, which is in our participation, not with the archetypes, but with the substance of virtues that close us off through prudence to that which is negative to us.
Beautifully said, I've really enjoyed this discussion. Forgive me for having to run that, and what you just said was just beautiful. I completely agree. You know God via myself, knowing yourself as virtuous, for in yourself as virtuous, you're participating in God. Yes, exactly. Virtue, you also were saying that regulation is needed for the variance of diversity to not, fall apart. You could say virtue is regulatory. Virtue is the proper form of regulation that does not kill the diversity. Because you have to have regulation that maintains relationality. Because diversity, another way, I guess, to put it is diversity all entails diverse things heading toward self-symmetry in themselves as isomorphic. So if you don't have something to keep them together, they're going to drift and then become enclosed, right? So regulation keeps them here. Whereas since the encounter of otherness is hard, though, without virtue, you're just going to say, well, that's irrational to stay here. Let me drift off, and then you get enclosed, right? Auto-cannibalism is rational for the non-virtuous. That's the problem. Like without virtue, rationality, quote unquote, autonomous rationality leads you to auto-cannibalism. Also, what you're saying about discernment, I couldn't agree more. For me, discernment in this highest sense requires a diversity of meta judgment. You really can't discern if you're stuck in a communicative paradigm, a communication paradigm, right? Discernment is the ability to work with a plethora of meta judgments and to be able to find what is fitting, proportional, et cetera, et cetera. So I think absolutely discernment is huge. And if you remove, like you're saying, if you remove the possibility of discernment, there's no salvation. There's just, I guess, empty, hollow things doing empty, hollow things that are thus auto-cannibalistic, but there's no personal causation. Ika, I could say a lot more, but I will have to run. I've really enjoyed it. I hope we can do it again. I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. You have a great one, and God bless you, friend.
God bless you. Thank you. All the best to you. All the best.